So, under students, Mr. Williams here, taking you through our third subsection of notes here for section 13, Reagan and the American Resurgence. We're going to kind of combine some things that we've mentioned in the first two subsections here to discuss the rebuilding of the American economy throughout the decade. We started to examine this a little bit towards the end of section 12, the stagnant 70s. We noted that Jimmy Carter, who had a Democratic Congress, he was a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress, was able to actually get some items passed, just very few. You'd think it would have been more, but again, being a political outsider, not a lot of the DC establishment wanted to work with him. He was able to get a few things instituted, all right, and actually took some executive action, if you will, or was able to, through the executive branch, take some action that actually laid some of the groundwork for, if handled correctly, an American economic resurgence, okay? So as we start to look at these first few slides here and start to examine some of the information in this third subsection, it's not as if Ronald Reagan came in and waved a magic wand and ta-da, the economy was fixed, which is kind of the common rhetoric in presidential politics today. Reagan had, as we noted in the last subsection, a steadfast resolve and belief in his ideology, some of the more conservative ideology, and that it would most definitely continue to build on some of the parameters that were instituted under Jimmy Carter, okay, who did some things that were atypical of a Democratic politician. So Reagan, yes, absolutely institutes some of his own believed upon and desired policy, but he builds it on some items that were already present, okay? But nevertheless, the Reagan administration, America in general, deserves a lot of credit from the early to mid-'80s on in regards to getting this thing up and going once again. Political cartoon here, kind of poking fun at the common debate, similar to whether or not FDR's New Deal was successful. All right, we noted that way back in the fall. Constant conversation about, did Reaganomics, the nickname collectively used to describe Reagan's domestic financial / economic policy, did Reaganomics really yield the economic success that majority of Americans experienced during the 1980s? Some facts here to hit you with, okay? The first couple of years of Reagan's first term, things did not improve. They actually got worse, okay? Unemployment, inflation, interest rates, all of them climb. The morale of our nation was still very low, even though for a good portion of the American public, we were still trying to latch on to the resonating patriotism and American exceptionalism that Reagan oozed. Okay, we were trying to latch on to that and you know, build upon that. Economically speaking, things really weren't turning the corner. Reagan and his staff believed in supply-side economics. You'll also hear the term Reaganomics and trickle-down economics associated with this. It's built off of the premise of some of the things I mentioned in subsection 2 that were prominent in the 1920s under Republican leadership. Laissez-faire, baby. Back off. Let the free market do what it does. And ultimately, at the end of the day, over time, everybody's going to benefit. Thinking back again to the John Green video that was linked in the Section 12 material, he mentioned how the stagnant economy of the 1970s, one of the legacy items was probably the birth of substantial income inequality. Well, if this grouping of economic policy was allowed to continue to work, and theoretically unchecked over time, maybe we make some ground up in the income equality that was born in the 70s and continued to an extent to grow in the 1980s. But laissez-faire, Reaganomics is all about cutting government regulation. So get the government out of monitoring, regulating, and controlling business practice, okay? Cut taxes for businesses and the general public alike. That allows for more free movement of cash. and cut government spending. So if you're going to cut taxes, you're going to decrease the amount of money that the government has to provide all of its social welfare and or, in general, government programs. That could also include the military. Reagan believed that with more money in the pockets of Americans, more money freely moving through our economic system at the business level and investment level, that would eventually trickle down to those individuals that were utilizing many of these social welfare programs, and they wouldn't be needed. This was attempted in Kansas under Sam Brown back in the mid-aughts, the early to mid-teens. But they never did starve the beast. So there were substantial, significant tax cuts, especially in the world of business in the state of Kansas, but they were never able to, as a state legislature, to cut government spending. Even Republicans, who historically run on the idea of limited government, low government spending, wanted to be reelected, therefore would not cut some of the government programs that go to assisting their constituents. It's one of those things where you might have to bite the bullet for several quarters or several years to eventually to get things balanced out. Reagan talked a big game, but ultimately was not able to cut government spending substantially enough to not run a budget deficit every year. But Reaganomics built off of these principles. Early on, stuff is not working, and it's looking like, as we get into the second half of Reagan's first term as president, the 1984 re-election campaign might be really, really difficult. However, by 1984, things start to turn the corner. First and foremost, the world oil supply /price /market begins to stabilize. Okay, so we don't have a lot of fluctuations there. Remember, that was the catalytic event back in the 70s, the aspect that funding, or your bottom line to produce, to distribute all of your goods and services, all of that became ridiculously expensive. So that was the wrench that was thrown into the entire system that wreaked havoc on the American economy throughout the 1970s. That variable levels out. It stabilizes. It's no longer volatile. With that, some of the other policies, some of the other ideas that were instituted by Carter and most notably built upon by Reagan, they start to take hold. Unemployment drops from double digits in March of 1982 to 6% by 1984. Inflation is down to single digits from 13%. This is huge. Okay, so not only do Americans have more money, they can get further with the cash that they now possess in comparison to the previous decade. And, all right, the government is able to start manipulating interest rates or encourage lenders to manipulate interest rates in a fashion that entices people to borrow once again, and not only borrow, but to make something of that substantial amount that they're borrowing. So things start to turn the corner in 1984. Americans aren't only now yearning to feel better about their situation, they're legitimately starting to feel better about their situation. There's still some critics, though. Again, Reagan dealt with a media not as adversarial as Nixon, the Nixon years. Again, Nixon was a very adversarial, confrontational figure, love-hate guy. Reagan, not so much. But the media elite, which typically leans to the left, okay, still wanted to chastise the dim-witted, not very intelligent, common-spoken Ronald Reagan. There was some legitimate critique, though, okay, as Reagan and his administration were relatively tone-deaf to assisting the poor, to assisting minority communities. I say tone-deaf. It's not as if assistance didn't exist, but the manner in which maybe the message or what was actually taking place, the action, what was the manner in which that was covered and shared, not well done by the PR wing of the Reagan White House, okay? Reagan continues to spearhead the idea that government is the problem. You got to trim this bad boy back. The fact that we have financial oppression in some of these poor areas, minority communities and poor white America. The fact that Main Street closed through some of these states that were populated with white individuals greater than minority backgrounds. That is an aspect of great society programs. That's an aspect of greater government intervention, etc. Government's the problem. So he continues to push that through his first term as president, ultimately just trying to drown out the critics that say you're not doing enough for the poor. We need more government intervention for these individuals. He continues to push the idea that it's community support, it's the local and regional economies that will help to drag those individuals out of generational poverty. And ultimately, the majority of Americans get on that wagon. They jump aboard, and this phrase used to describe this mindset, this shift of not anti-government, but less government, described as the Reagan Revolution. Okay, the Reagan Revolution kind of goes lock and step with American Resurgence of the 1980s. Reagan's popularity is ridiculously high by the summer and fall of 1984. He's the most popular president since FDR. Okay, and FDR had his critics as well. Again, and they weren't unjust in their critique of policy and action from the FDR cabinet. The American economy is growing in power. Overall patriotism and confidence of being an American increasing. Groups that traditionally voted Democrat for the past several election cycles are now supporting Ronald Reagan. You actually have self-proclaimed and identified Democrats that are now Reagan Democrats, okay? Catholics, union members, individuals in the South starting to vote Republican, getting away from a lot of the recent history that may now be seen as not very successful regarding Democratic policies and Democratic politics, okay? Because you got to think this goes back for the most part, minus Nixon, who still had some relatively left-leaning or Democratic actions, all right, as a Republican president. You've got JFK, LBJ, Jimmy Carter, and a lot of that Democratic control in Congress and that Democratic influence in the White House, gave us or led us to a certain degree the situation that we are in now that appears to be getting better because of Ronald Reagan and his leadership. The election in 1984, Reagan goes with a fabulous campaign slogan, and I've got this commercial. I'll upload it and probably share it with you as well. It's Morning in America, and it's just a spot-on commercial here, basically kind of, celebrating the rebirth of traditional American values and American exceptionalism, all right? So we'll go ahead and check that bad boy out. I've got the PDF pulled up right now, but we'll put that in there for you. I might include it in an email, but fabulous campaign video, and he dominates Walter Mondale, the previous vice president for Jimmy Carter, at the polls in 1984. Absolute trouncing. But for the most part, Reagan says, hey, are you better off? Kind of uses the same rhetoric he used in 80. Are you better off now than you were in 1980? Then vote for me. Keep this show going. One notable thing about Mondale is he nominated the first female to a potential executive position in our national government with Geraldine Ferrero. So when, identity politics is huge in America today, understand that we actually had a significant movement for a minority candidate for the presidency in 1984. Reverend Reggie Jackson had a chance at that. Reggie Jackson, hold on. I don't think it's Reggie Jackson. That's the baseball player. Oh, goodness. Oh, it's escaping me now. All right, we'll come back to it later, but I'll mention it in the next subsection. But yes, 1984, the Democrats, kind of scrounging for a candidate that could maybe make a little headway against Ronald Reagan, who the vast majority of the DNC, Democratic National Committee, knew they're not going to defeat. There was a big ploy to try to, again, make a splash in the area of identity politics, and that's, well over 30 years ago now. So this whole notion of identity politics and mainstream, governmental affairs it's been around for a while. But Geraldine Ferrero was the female vice president candidate with Walter Mondale. Okay, that does it for this subsection of notes. We will pick it up. I believe we get into the me decade. We might cover the me decade. We might get into the end of the Cold War, but the next subsection will dabble with a little bit of both. That does it for some of the insight into the rebuilding of the American economy in the early to mid 1980s with the Reagan administration. All right. Got any questions? Don't hesitate to contact me. Later.